Okay, so nuclear war, not exactly light brunch conversation, right? But it's real, even though the Cold War has been over for ages. And if you're with us for this deep dive, I'm guessing you're as curious as I am about what that actually means. Like, what would we be dealing with? We're going deep on Dr. Esme's work, super interesting stuff on survival strategies, especially for folks who, don't have a luxury bunker situation going on.
It is crucial to have this information out there, especially now, right, when everyone's kind of on edge about this stuff. Dr. May breaks down the science of these weapons, the effects, which I think is so important for people to understand. Like, that's step one to feeling prepared.
Exactly. So no bunker building today, but we are going to arm ourselves with knowledge. And first up, got to get this. There are different kinds of nuclear weapons, not just one big scary bomb. Dr. May talks about four main ones: fission bombs, fusion bombs, neutron bombs, then dirty bombs.
Right. And those terms sound kind of sci-fi movie, but honestly, once you get the basics, it's not that complicated.
I hope so. Okay, so fission bombs. Probably the most unfortunately famous type. Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, those were fission bombs. Little boy and fat man.
History we all wish we didn't know, right? What they do is split heavy atoms like uranium, plutonium, and that releases insane energy.
Names forever tied to that. Okay, then there's fusion bombs, which are basically worse, like fission bombs, but bigger.
Basically, yeah, hydrogen bombs, that's another name for them, even more powerful because they use fission to kickstart fusion. So you're fusing light atoms together. Even crazier energy release, which means, well, way more destruction.
Okay, so those two are all about raw power, but then you've got neutron bombs, which sound just sinister, right?
The thing about neutron bombs is they were designed to maximize radiation, but minimize the blast itself, almost like a targeted attack on people, less so buildings. Kind of creepy when you think about it.
Yeah, no kidding. And last, we've got dirty bombs, which are those even really nuclear weapons in the same way? They're not like classic nuclear weapons. It's more about spreading panic and contamination. Conventional explosives mixed with radioactive stuff. Aim is fear and disruption, more so than just blowing stuff up.
Okay, so we've got these different types, each scary in its own way. But let's say one actually goes off. What happens then? Like, how does the radiation actually spread, and how fast are we talking?
That's where Dr. May's work gets super relevant, I think. He lays out these timelines for fallout. You've got the immediate fallout, first 24 hours.
So that's the initial blast of all the radioactive stuff into the air.
Exactly. And depending on how big the bomb was, the wind, all that, these particles can travel crazy distances.
Yeah.
Hundreds of miles. Like, imagine radioactive stuff reaching other countries within hours.
That's fast. So what happens after that first wave?
Then there's short-term fallout. That's from like day 1 to day 7. Now you've got debris settling down, contaminating everything. Rain, snow, that actually makes it worse, spreads it further.
So it's not just the immediate blast zone, it's a widening area over time.
Right. And then you've got long-term contamination, and that can last for months, years, even decades, some of it. Certain radioactive stuff, cesium-137, strontium-90, they hang around for a long, long time.
So even if you somehow survive the first blast, then the fallout settling. There's this lingering threat. What does that actually mean for people?
It means years later, this stuff could still be in the environment. Food, water, all contaminated. And that, of course, has huge implications for agriculture. That's a whole other layer of disaster.
Yeah, it's like, even if the blast doesn't get you, everything's poisoned anyway. What happens to farms, to the crops? I can't imagine it's good.
Devastating. First, there's the immediate stuff, fires, the shockwaves, and then obviously the fallout blanketing everything. Crops are gone instantly, soil and water sources are poisoned, whole farming regions basically unusable.
So even if farmers, survive as people, they might have nothing left to farm.
Exactly. Then you've got the short-term impact. Crops that are already growing, they become unsafe to eat. Farmers have to abandon their land, which means food shortages. The whole economic system gets messed up.
And even if the contamination goes down eventually, that's still a long recovery, right, for agriculture to come back.
It could take years for land to be usable again, especially if you need to, decontaminate the soil. Farmers got to find new sources for crops, rebuild everything. It's a huge undertaking.
This is all sounding pretty bleak, got to be honest. What can regular people actually do? If you don't have one of those fancy bunkers or tons of survival gear, where do you even begin?
That's where Dr. May, focusing on marginalized communities, on practical stuff, is so helpful. He's saying, Even without tons of resources, there are things you can do to increase your chances.
It's not just about hunkering down, right? He's talking about a whole approach, community stuff, education, even DIY strategies.
Exactly. This is key, I think, for anyone listening. It's not just you surviving, it's about everyone working together.
So let's get into those recommendations. What are some of the big things Dr. May suggests?
First off, awareness and education, huge. Communities got to understand the risks, what to do if something happens, and have good info to rely on.
So it's turning that fear into action, basically.
Right, and local organizations, they've got to step up. Workshops, giving people resources, building that preparedness mindset.
Okay, now for sheltering in place, does he have any tips? Because not everyone has a basement, let alone a bunker.
You'd be surprised. You don't necessarily need some crazy underground setup. Basements, interior rooms, even under sturdy furniture, that can offer some protection.
Seriously, like just a normal basement could help. That changes things for a lot of people, I bet.
It can make a difference, yeah. Find the safest spots in your house, stock up on essentials, make the best of what you've got. The small things can add up.
That's good to know. What other stuff, like simple but effective, does he recommend?
Sealing off entry points, even that can do a lot. Like, think about it. Plastic sheeting over windows, doors, stops some of that radioactive stuff from getting in. Not perfect, but buys you time.
Like a giant Ziploc bag for your house.
Pretty much. And then community networks, those are huge in a crisis. Dr. May talks about forming groups to share resources, info, plan evacuation routes.
Right, because in a disaster, your neighbors are your lifeline.
Totally. Working together, supporting each other, sharing what you have, that increases everyone's chances.
It's like, I don't know, barn raising, but with way higher stakes. It's amazing how much you can do when you work together.
It is. And then there's more specific stuff, like potassium iodide.
Right. That helps with radioactive iodine, which can be a big problem after an event like this.
Sure.
But is that something people even have access to?
You're right. It's not just sitting on the shelf at the pharmacy. But Dr. May says local health programs should think about giving it out to people. Like, it's a fire extinguisher. Hope you never need it, but good to have.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, so what about food? Once this happens, how do we know what's safe to eat?
We'd need systems to test crops, see how contaminated they are. Government, nonprofits, they'd need to tell people what's okay, what crops are safe to plant.
So farmers, everyone, needs access to those tests, to reliable information. Makes you realize how much we rely on systems we don't even think about, right?
Definitely. It shows how fragile things are and how important it is to have backup plans to support each other.
This is heavy stuff, but so important to know. Dr. May's research, it lays out the scary facts, but I'm glad he also gives some hope. Things we can do. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but it reminds us we're not powerless. We can make choices. We can make a difference.
It's interesting, right? Thinking about how Dr. May's stuff applies to different places. Like, what works in one community might be totally different somewhere else.
Well, for sure. Context matters. Big time. Like, a strategy that's perfect for a rural area probably won't fly in a city, right?
Exactly. He really stresses that. Tailoring your approach to the specific conditions, resources, what kind of infrastructure is already there, even cultural stuff, that all plays a part.
Makes sense. It's not one size fits all.
Nope. And that's why community involvement is so big in his work. Like, the people on the ground, they know what they need, right? It's empowering them to find solutions that work for them. Builds that sense of ownership that they're part of making things safer.
It's like think globally, act locally, but with a nuclear twist.
Yeah.
And it's not just the practical stuff, right? We got to talk about the mental and emotional side of this too. Like a crisis like this,
Yeah.
that messes with people.
Absolutely. A huge chunk of Dr. May's research is about that, mental and emotional resilience, especially with something as potentially traumatic as, a nuclear detonation.
We don't always think about that side of things when we talk about disaster preparedness.
But it's key. He talks about community support networks, having mental health resources available, even cultural stuff, spiritual beliefs. Those can play a big part in helping people cope. That sense of community that you're not alone, that makes a difference.
It's that human connection, right, that can really help in a crisis. Reminds us that even if this awful thing happens, we still have each other.
Exactly. That resilience, that hope, it's powerful. Especially when you're dealing with something this big, this scary.
What strikes me about Dr. May's work is it really humanizes this whole thing. Nuclear preparedness. It's not just numbers and jargon. It's about people, communities figuring this out together.
Totally agree. He bridges that gap, the hard science and what it means for us as humans, which is so important with a topic like this that's loaded with emotion.
It's a good reminder that even if it feels hopeless, there are things we can do. For ourselves, for our loved ones, we're not totally helpless. We can build resilience. We can hope for a better future.
And that's a message that needs to be heard. So, to everyone listening, what are you thinking? What parts of Dr. May's work stood out to you?
Jump into the conversation on social media. Let us know.
We're always looking for new angles, new ideas, stuff to explore in our next deep dives.
Because knowledge is power, right? The more we understand, the better we can handle whatever comes our way. Build a safer, more resilient world for us and for everyone who comes after.
Well said. And it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving, rebuilding, adapting, making a future where this threat is just a memory.
That's a good vision to hold on to. Easy to get lost in the fear.
Yeah.
But humans are tough, right? We've been through so much, and we always find a way to adapt, to come up with new ideas, to rebuild.
We do. We can learn from what's happened before, build a more peaceful world, make sure nuclear war stays in the history books.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Dr. May's research, one last thought for you. What's one thing you can do today to make yourself, your community more resilient? Could be something small, like looking up local resources, talking to your family about emergency plans, finding a community group focused on preparedness. Every step, no matter how small, it adds up.
It does, to a safer, stronger future.
And on that note, thanks for being with us for this deep dive. Hope you learned something that you feel a little more empowered, maybe even a little inspired. Remember, knowledge is power, and we can face anything together.
You know, it's funny, as we've been talking about all this survival stuff, it kind of hit me. There's some weird parallels to the climate crisis, right?
Oh, yeah, I see that. It's all about thinking long-term, being ready for things to get disrupted, changing how we live.
Exactly. And like with climate change, it's so easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, what can one person even do? This problem is huge. That's where that whole collective action thing comes in again. Like, all our individual choices, they can build up to a bigger movement, right? Same with this. Even small steps towards being prepared, it adds up. For individuals, for communities.
It's about changing how we think about it, not being scared and helpless, but like empowered.
Exactly. And Dr. May's all about that in his work. Even with this crazy threat, we have choices. We can do something.
So if you're listening and you're feeling kind of freaked out, just remember, you're not alone in this. There's help, communities you can join, things you can do, even small things to feel more ready, more resilient.
That's a good takeaway, I think. Not just for nuclear stuff, but for anything life throws at you.
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one last thought. What's one thing you can do today, right now, to make yourself, your community more resilient? Doesn't have to be big. Look up some local resources, talk to your family about emergency plans, maybe find a group in your area that's all about preparedness.
Each step, no matter how tiny, it gets us closer to that safer, stronger future.
Kind of said it better myself. And on that note, huge thanks to everyone for joining us for this deep dive. Hope you learned something new, that you feel a little more ready for whatever might come. Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can face anything.